Good morning, good morning. It's Charmaine Hammond, and we're here today with our second webinar in the series for NIOSH Week, the North American Occupational Health and Safety Week, a week that we recognize every year because it's so important in terms of creating organizations that are healthy, resilient, and safe. So I'm Charmaine Hammond. I'm going to be facilitating this webinar for you today. We've got about 45 minutes. Of course, we're recording the webinar so that you can watch it later, share it in your teams, and certainly circulate it around your organization. Many of you I've met before, so you've heard a little bit about my background, but let me just share with you a little bit more about who I am and what I do. And more importantly, what my background is in the area of conflict resolution, because you'll certainly see in a short while the connection between conflict resolution and how it can increase our safety and decrease the near misses and the mishaps that we have in our organization that threaten people's safety. I take you back way back to 1985. I graduated from a correctional worker program in Ontario, which is where we're from, Ontario, Canada. And I was a correctional officer for about 10 years, initially working in the adult institutions and then moving over to working with young offenders. Now, as you can imagine, working in a facility such as a correctional center, safety is of the utmost importance. Not only safety for staff, but of course safety for the inmates and residents. So I learned a lot about safety. When I moved away from working in adult institutions to working in and later supervising and leading young offender facilities, I realized that some of the safety practices we had in the institution needed to be modified for a different type of a setting. And all of you have seen that in your own workplace, that depending on where you work and the type of setting that you work in, how you manage safety is going to differ from organization to organization and facility or office to office. Now, after working in the correctional system with young offenders, which is where I had my first leadership position, I became really interested in learning more about different ways to resolve conflict. Certainly the ways that we were resolving conflict in the correctional system didn't necessarily work in other environments because, of course, in a correctional system you have all kinds of resources, segregation cells, handcuffs, additional staff, and when we went into a different type of facility, the young offender facility, we didn't have all those resources to support us. So I learned new skills. And like many of you, we're still learning new skills as we get more and more seasoned in our career. Now, when I left the correctional system, I actually went back to school, got a master's degree in conflict analysis and management, mainly because I really enjoyed the process of conflict resolution. I was able to learn firsthand, working in corrections, that conflict resolution can bring about amazing results for people who are experiencing a dispute when it's well managed, when it's dealt with in a timely fashion, and when it's resolved from an interest-based process, and we're going to talk about that today. So I opened up a mediation practice where we are living in Fort McMurray, Alberta, Canada. It was a thriving business. We quickly grew from myself as the key mediator to several other full-time mediators, and then I became sought after more and more from corporations and industry to start teaching the skills of conflict resolution and mediation so that workplaces could start to resolve their own issues instead of having to call in a mediator. And that's where I really found my passion, was in speaking and training. So that's my background around conflict. I have mediated hundreds and hundreds of disputes, really complex, difficult, highly oppositional type disputes with thousands of people around the globe, and I've trained thousands of people to have the skills to resolve conflict in the workplace. Now, in terms of who you are, there is a chat box on the webinar. You'll see that. I would love for you to share with us where you're listening from, who you are, and here's the question for you all. I want you to think about this question. When you hear the word conflict, what is the first word that comes to mind? And I welcome you to share that in the chat box. I also welcome you to ask questions in the chat box. I'll be heading over there every few minutes just to see if there's questions. I actually had some questions come in by email from people that couldn't join us live today. I promised that I would definitely bring the questions forward. So please use the chat box. I will be checking it. Tell us who you are, where you're listening from, and the first word that comes to mind when you hear the word conflict. So let's talk about what we're going to cover today. We are going to talk about what conflict is. It's really important to have a working definition, and we use the word conflict all the time in the workplace. The challenge is we understand it differently. We're going to talk about what conflict resolution is and some of the best strategies to resolve conflict, and why when we resolve conflict effectively, efficiently, and in a timely manner, how that can actually increase safety in the workplace and reduce near misses. And that's one of the big focuses with NIOSH Week, which is the North American Occupational Safety and Health Week, is really about promoting safety and reducing incidents that put people's safety at risk in the workplace. We're also going to talk about how to build a team charter. And a team charter is really a process and a document that guides people through understanding how as a team they're going to work together. And this can have tremendous benefits for you around dealing with conflict effectively in the workplace and in a respectful way, and also increasing safety. We're also going to talk about a 5-step model that I've used for many years, in fact, since 1985, that works and can really help you in managing conflict in the workplace. And then we're going to end off talking about what about if your position, maybe you're a safety officer, a human resource professional, a leader, a business owner, and you're often in the position of having to facilitate people through conflict. You've got 2 employees that aren't getting along, and you've got to help them through the process. What does that look like? How do you do that? So we'll be talking about that as well. So we've got someone from Edmonton, Sunny in Edmonton, and the first word that Christine thinks of when she hears the word conflict is stressful. I think there's a lot of people that are in agreement with you, Christine. In fact, when I go around the world speaking about conflict and conflict resolution, here's how people describe conflict. It's negative. It should be avoided at all costs. It's awful. I lose sleep over it. It's stressful. It's anxiety producing. It has damaging results. Those are mostly the ways that I hear conflict being described. And there's another way to look at conflict. And I hope today that we'll be able to talk about changing our perceptions or the lenses in which we view conflict from. And here's why I bring that up is that it's really an opportunity, because at the very basic fundamental definition of conflict is simply differing opinions or differing viewpoints, or a divergence between people's needs and values. So conflict really isn't good or bad, it just simply is. And it's just about difference of opinion. What happens though in conflict, and every single one of you have seen this, is what people do with conflict that can be good or bad or healthy or unhealthy. We've got a couple of other comments. Conflict can be seen as not seeing the other person's perspective. Absolutely. Conflict often exists because of that disagreement. And here's an interesting thought about conflict. I remember one of the first mediations I did. It was actually a divorce mediation, and I've learned that if you can mediate divorces, wow, workplace conflicts can actually be a little bit easier to mediate. You know, in this particular separation, like many other divorces where relationships are ending, there is a severe divergence of opinions, and what we have to worry about is how we manage those differences and how we manage those opinions so that the issues get addressed effectively and respectfully. Here's the challenge with that, is that when we have those differences of opinions, normally what happens is people come across as very oppositional. My way or your way, his way or their way. In organizations, we often see it's us against them. Have any of you ever experienced that, us against them feeling? We see it all the time in workplace conflict. And when we come from that perspective of us versus them, it's me against you, the challenge is that we are just setting ourselves up for a failure. We're setting ourselves up for a conflict that just sort of feels like a power struggle, where we're not going to get past the opinions to be able to get to solving the issue. So I take you back to this example I was going to talk about in a separation and divorce mediation. It was highly oppositional. The people in conflict were so angry at each other. There had been so many years of disappointments and regrets and frustrations that it was really difficult for them to have a conversation that was respectful. And it constantly kept coming back to blame. You did this wrong. Well, you did this wrong. And there was no understanding going on about what really mattered. And at the end of the day, what really mattered to both of them was having an agreement between these two parents that would help build healthy children. They had a couple of kids. And that's what was really driving their positional opinions, their positional feelings. And it was what was driving this me against you atmosphere and the conflict. They both really wanted at the end of the day what was best for their kids, but because of what had happened in their relationship and the disappointments they both had, they were targeting each other through emotion. And we see the exact same thing in the workplace, don't we? We see that people get highly emotional and highly positional and begin to target one another in the conflict. In the workplace. We see it all the time. So what ended up happening with this particular case, as we had the opportunity to ask a lot of questions to both parties in the conflict about what was important, why they felt so strongly on the outcomes that they were proposing, something rich and magic started to occur. They started to hear each other differently. And that's one of the important elements of conflict. We often rush through these conversations and we're distracted, we're emotional, we have lots going on. In fact, we're managing lots in a conflict. We are managing the drama that goes with it. We're managing history, our past disappointments, our past issues. We're managing our solutions that we have in our head that we are really tied to. We're managing assumptions that have not been checked out yet. Then in a workplace, we're also managing policies, we're managing a workplace culture, we're managing our goals for our career, lots going on in the conflict. Now, what was so interesting, this particular case that I wondered if we would get through it, became one of the most successful mediations I ever did, because together these parents, once they started to talk about what was important and why, they were able to find solutions that addressed both of their priorities. And that's what we call interest-based negotiation. Interest-based mediation. It's where we look at the issue, the problem, and then together we define solutions that address what's important to both people. It's exactly what they did. In fact, this mediation was so successful that the couple later actually brought the kids into the room with them and explained together as a very cohesive, loving team, this mom and this dad, about some of the agreements that the kids wanted to know answers to. Who's going to take me to soccer? Where will I live? What do I do for Christmas? All those questions that little kids have. And the parents had come together and aligned their solutions because they now had heard each other and addressed what was important, and they solved the issues in a way that met most of their needs, their underlying interests. We can do the same thing in workplaces. I've done it hundreds of times. And when we can resolve conflict to that level where we really get in understanding and listening and people communicating in a respectful, non-judgmental, non-blaming way, solutions can be long-lasting. And that's why conflict resolution really impacts workplace safety. When we are in conflict, you've all been there before, we're distracted. We're not thinking about, we're not 100% present, so we're missing some of the steps at work. We're not fully present. We're missing some of the warning signs. And I see a lot of times when teams are experiencing high degrees of conflict or dissension, even stress, what happens is that there's a lot of near misses, mistakes that could have been avoided. And some of you have probably seen that. So I'm going to go to a couple of questions that I had. Please feel free to type any questions or comments that you have in the chat box. One of the questions that came up was, I think, a really great question to start us off with as we start to look at how do we deal with conflict in the workplace so that we can actually reduce drama. Here's how we can do it. We can actually start to think about conflict as an opportunity, as something that is worth solving, as an opportunity to learn about somebody. So I'm going to give you an exercise here in the chat box and just on your note paper. I'd like you to think about the first word that came to mind for you. So for example, Christine said it can be stressful, or it can be about not seeing the other person's perspective. So I want you to write down on one side of the paper what your first word that when you think of conflict is. And on the other side of the paper, I'd like you to write down what it could be instead. So reframing that perspective to something positive. So I'm going to give you a minute to do that, and then we will come back and check out some answers. So again, the activity is for each of us to write down what our first word is when we think of conflict, and then how could we reframe it into something positive. I'll give you about 30 seconds to do that. And then I'm going to answer that person's question, because I think it's one that many of you are interested in, especially what happens if the person you're in conflict with does not want to resolve the conflict. I imagine that many of you have had that situation. You're in a conversation with someone, you're in a conflict, and they actually do not want to resolve it. They don't even want to have a conversation with you. So what do we do about that? So I'm going to go over to the chat box here. See if we got anything. So here's what the one individual said. They said that their perspective of conflict was that it was something that actually should be avoided. They really saw conflict as having no benefit. And so when I posed the question back to the individual, I thought, what could conflict be perceived as instead? Because if we see it as something that's awful and it has to be avoided, think about this. This is going to affect how you actually have the conversation, how you go and deal with that person. So if our mindset is that it needs to be avoided at all costs and it's going to be awful, guess what? We've just made a decision. It is going to be awful. It's going to be a terrible conversation because you decided that. And what happens is when we make a decision, our brain kind of looks for reasons to support that decision. And it affects, our mindset actually affects how we think about people and how we communicate with people. Mindset is really critical. That's why we're doing this exercise. I love this. So we have a comment here, going from disruptive to trying to be enlightening. Beautiful. Great example of how we can reframe that. When we can go into a conflict and see it as an opportunity, it's an opportunity for a new discussion, new understandings. It's an opportunity to clear the air. It's an opportunity to learn something new. What happens now is we go into the conflict perhaps with curiosity. We go in with openness. We withhold our judgments and assumptions. So the first step in dealing with conflict is getting a mindset that is actually neutral or positive about conflict. And we actually have to train our brain. I know that sounds funny, but we have to train our brain to actually be able to see and think about conflict differently. Be careful of the language that you use, because the language you use around conflict will absolutely shape how you deal with it. Oh, okay, so we've got the mindset piece. The question that came up from somebody was, what do you do when the person that you have a disagreement with absolutely does not want to talk to you about it? And they say things like, I don't have a problem. It's your problem. You're the only one thinking this. So if that's the case, here's what I've learned. If it's a problem for you, it's a problem for the relationship. If it's a problem for you, it's a problem for the relationship. So that person may not have a conflict with you, and that's totally okay. But whatever is going on for you, it's important that you somehow address it. Now, addressing it could be just deciding on your own that, you know what, this is not the hill to die on. I'm going to pick my battle, so to speak, and I'm just going to resolve this in my own head so that I don't affect the relationship. That's one way to deal with it. That's just called resolving and closing. The other thing to think about is if it's really bugging you, if there's something going on with another person and it really is getting under your skin, then what we want to do is give feedback. It might not be a conflict resolution discussion, so to speak. It might simply be giving someone feedback. And the important parts of giving feedback, this was the next question that came up, is how do you give someone feedback? And what if they're your supervisor? Love that question, because there's certainly risks in people's minds about giving feedback to a supervisor. The first thing we've got to do is practice. And many of you who have participated in webinars or workshops with me have heard me say this before, but we absolutely have to prepare for these conversations, whether they be in our personal life or our work life. And today we're talking about our work life. If we don't prepare for these conversations, we pretty much set it up for disaster. We're going to say things we don't mean. We're going to use nonverbals that accentuate something to the point of disrupting the conversation. We're going to not listen as effectively. Listening is actually a difficult process, and it's the most important skill in conflict. Listening is the ability to take in information that people are saying and then actually process it, and then be able to put out your perspective or ask a question to further the conversation. So we've got this positive perspective now of conflict, or at least a neutral perspective that allows us to go in and be open-minded and curious and respectful. Now we are wanting to bring the situation up, and that preparation is key. And here's how I prepare. I simply take a piece of paper, just a blank piece of paper, and then I take a Sharpie. If I don't have a Sharpie, I just use a pen. And then what I do is go into a room that has a mirror. I write down the key points, not the sentences, the key points of what I want to say to that person and what are the important pieces to bring up. And then I rehearse it, and I rehearse it, and I rehearse it again, actually about 10 times. And the reason you're doing that is to lock in the key points so that when you get into the conversation, it doesn't feel so stressful or overwhelming for you, or we don't get sidetracked as easily when someone says something that lands the wrong way for us. The second reason that we practice in front of a mirror is to actually work through the drama. We have drama attached to disagreements and conflict. We have history, emotion, fear. Many of us are really nervous in these conversations. So you're managing fear. So take care of you. Manage yourself. When you can manage yourself and your own fear, and part of that comes through preparing, then you will come into the conflict or to the feedback conversation so much further ahead than you had if you had just come in cold with no preparation. So that's one way I would suggest to be prepared to have the conversations with people. Now, if it's your supervisor, sometimes people need a bit of coaching or mentoring, and you might have that service or support available in your office. I see a lot of times what happens, though, in the workplace is people go to their colleagues to bounce something off them about their supervisor. And mostly what I have seen when people are bouncing something off someone, usually it is gossip, negative gossip, not good gossip. And the problem is when we bounce something off someone who also has a relationship with the person that we're concerned about, we can compromise that relationship. We can actually get in the way of trust. So be very, very careful who you bounce something off someone. And I strongly urge not even using that language, bounce something off someone. I would go to somebody and say, look, I have a situation. It doesn't matter who it is. The details don't matter. I really just want to practice what I'm going to say to this person and have you hear it. But again, I'm really careful with who I do that with, because I want to manage the integrity of that person's relationship with the person that we have a concern about. So I would strongly not recommend you going to colleagues and coworkers with this, because the other thing you all know is that as soon as you've had that conversation, it goes through the office like wildfire, even if you ask someone to keep it confidential, because people go and talk to each other with innuendos. They'll say things like, oh, you should have heard the conversation I just had about so-and-so with so-and-so. And they haven't mentioned any names, but it didn't take much to figure out who they meant. So we really have to be careful of all the dynamics that go around conflict. These all create a higher degree of stress in the workplace, a lower degree of trust in the workplace, and certainly can impact our safety. So let's talk a little bit more about resolving conflict to increase safety and reduce near misses. When you can address conflict quickly and effectively, You reduce tension, you reduce fear, apprehension, you create clarity and certainty for people, and you can actually repair relationships. That's one of the beauties of conflict resolution, is it can actually repair and improve relationships. So it is worth spending the time. Now think about it this way. I gave an example on yesterday's webinar about how little things grow into big things. And the example I gave was, imagine yourself walking through a beautiful trail and you got this tiny little pebble in your shoe, just a tiny pebble. And you notice it and it starts to irritate you, and you keep walking. And you keep walking, and all of a sudden, after half an hour, this tiny pebble feels like it's this big, because little things grow into big things. It's the same thing when we're frustrated or have conflicts at work. Little things grow into big things. With conflict, little things grow into big things that include more people. And this is where safety really can become compromised. Typically, if there's a conflict between two people, very, very quickly, other people get involved. By other people, I mean they go and spread the word. So we have messengers and gossipers in the workplace that kind of spread the word of the conflict. People can see us interacting with somebody differently when we're in conflict. They can feel the emotion. They can actually also sense that there is a problem going on in the relationship. And what happens then is it creates a stronger degree of distrust that sort of ripples out through the organization. And so it's really important to manage these dynamics. History as well is a real problem. History comes up and gets in the way of us communicating effectively. So we want to set the stage for success, and we want to be able to create a safe environment for people to communicate. Here's the model that I use. It's a 5-step model, and it's based on what I did as a mediator, and it works. It absolutely works. The first thing we have to do is prepare. Now, part of the preparation is what I said earlier about preparing with a piece of paper and a pen and writing down your thoughts and what you want to share, and doing that in front of the mirror. But the second part of preparation is that we've got to get rid of all the judgments or assumptions that we've made about the person. We have to get rid of any attachment that we have to a particular solution. This is the tough part. We might be so attached to some kind of a solution that we can't hear other people's perspectives. So we have to be able to be open to ideas that other people have. The other part of preparing is being able to actually understand what your interests are, to really dig deep and think deep about what's important to you. And then to create what I call a mostly okay agreement. Let me tell you about that. The interest-based negotiation practices what we call a win-win. You've all heard that, right? Win-win. Here's what I learned after facilitating hundreds and hundreds of conflict resolution processes. I've learned that there mostly is not a win-win. Most people do not come out of a conversation about conflict saying, wow, that was a great conversation and I feel like I won and I feel like I won. Very rarely does that happen. Most people come out of a conversation saying, you know what, I can live with this agreement. And that's really what we want, is to be able to live with the agreement. So number one is we prepare. Number two is we have to figure out, what is the issue? What's the problem we're trying to solve? Then we have the conversation to solve it. That's a real quick part of the process. That's probably the fastest part of the process, is figuring out the topic for discussion. It's sort of like if you're in a staff meeting or a safety meeting, figuring out what's on the agenda for today. The third part of the process, so we prepare, which has many steps. We figure out the agenda or what we're here to talk about. Step number 3 now is all about the conversation. It's that back and forth dialogue that you and the other person have about the issue that you're talking about and why it's important to you. What matters to you? What are your underlying concerns and your underlying hopes and your underlying fears, your underlying needs? All of this gets talked about and discovered. And I suspect what happens in the process, which happens in the majority of these conversations when people are communicating effectively and respectfully and listening to one another, is some nuggets start to appear. And what I mean by nuggets is that you will start to hear what's important to people, what really matters. And as you're hearing that about other people, I suspect what's happening is you're hearing that some of those things are important to you as well. And what that starts to build is what we call shared understanding or shared priorities. And in a conversation, if you're in a conversation, a feedback conversation or a conflict conversation, and you hear someone say something like, oh, Charmaine, you know what, I just really want to have trust in this relationship. I really want to have trust and respect. And that's important for me too in a relationship. And I might simply say, you know what, I agree with you. Trust and respect is so important in a relationship, and it matters to me as well. Why is trust and respect so important to you? Notice that instead of me giving more information, I came back with another question. Questions are so important in conflict resolution. So important. And the questions we use start with who, what, where, when, why, and how. Let me say that again. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. These are open-ended questions. You guys use these all the time already in your work. Open-ended questions facilitate dialogue. It facilitates curiosity, and it facilitates understanding. If we ask closed-ended questions, did you, would you, could you, will you, won't you, all we get back is a yes or no answer. It doesn't further the dialogue. When you deeply understand why something's important to you. So if I said to the individual, why is trust and respect so important to you? Here's some things that I've heard in real life from people in the workplace. You know, trust is so important to me because I need to know that you've got my back. And then I might say, what do you mean by that? Why is that important? Notice I came back with a question again. And they might say, you know, Charmaine, I've worked in lots of workplaces where trust was low and there was gossip and there was people behaving in a way that really compromised safety and people's careers. And I don't want to go back there. And then I might say, wow, so trust is really important to you, not just because it's part of a relationship, but because you want to be able to know that you're safe at work. And they might say, yeah. And, you know, there's not much more to go on. And I say, and then I might come back and say, safety is important to me too. And here's why. And I would share my perspective. And then at the end of the conversation, what you're doing is capturing these nuggets. So I want to go to an example completely unrelated to workplace for a minute, just so we can get our head around this whole concept of understanding underlying interests. In conflict, people get positional and they have an answer to what the conflict is. And they believe that their answer is the answer. We all do it. We believe that our perspective is the perspective, but it simply is just a perspective. So this particular case was one of the first mediations I did. It was about family. And there was a teenager and a parent fighting about curfew. Oh my gosh, and I say fighting because they weren't talking. I had to intervene so much. But I finally, so they were arguing over 9 p.m. and midnight. And of course, you know who had 9 p.m., right? The parent. And the child wanted midnight. Child was still in high school. So they couldn't get past 9 p.m. midnight, 9 p.m. midnight. And the more they did that, the more oppositional their conflict and conversation became. You can see that. It's sort of like 9 p.m. midnight, 9 p.m. midnight. So I asked the question, Mom and Dad, why is 9 p.m. so important to you? And they came back and they said, you know, our son is brilliant. He is so brilliant and we see such a strong future for him. And we know he needs his sleep. And when he's not home, we worry. He's got good friends. We know he's not up to bad things, but we worry because we love him and we want him to be successful in school. Now, the child had never thought about that before. He just thought that Mom and Dad were being unreasonable, and they were the only parent in that community that thought 9 p.m. was a reasonable curfew. When I asked the son why he said midnight, here's what he said. He said, I don't expect midnight every night. Come on, seriously? I'm in grade 10. That's exactly what he said. He said, but you know what? On Thursdays, we go to the movies after football, and I'm the only one that has to leave. Like, Mom and Dad let me stay out till 10 on movie night, and I have to leave partway through. I look like a dork. My friends make fun of me for that. I don't know why I can't just stay out till midnight on Thursdays. So all of a sudden we went from I want midnight, meaning the parents made an assumption he meant every night. He actually meant Thursday nights. Very quickly, these very oppositional family members became aligned about an agreement that they could come up with. And they continued the conversation. I asked more and more questions, and the underlying interests that came up for the parents were success in school, making good decisions. The parents didn't distrust their child. They were struggling with the lack of control over their ability to influence their child anymore. They knew that their kid had good skills and would make good decisions. They just didn't feel like they had a control over that like they did when he was 2 or 3 or 5. The other thing that they really valued was their relationship with him. They were once seen in their eyes as the go-to. When their son had a problem, he went to mom and dad, and they were feeling excluded. None of this had come up in the 9 p.m. midnight conversation, none of it. When we asked the son what was important to him through the long conversation, he talked about wanting his parents to trust him, that he so valued his mom and dad's opinions that what his mom and dad would think about him actually guided a lot of his decisions. You can imagine how mom and dad felt when they heard that. But he also really valued individuality. He felt that he was at a time in his life when he wanted to have some freedom to make choices and make mistakes and be accountable for them. He also wanted to have individuality, which led into a conversation of him wanting to dye his hair blue and get a tattoo. That was a whole other mediation. But the cool thing was that they resolved the conflict, but more importantly, they repaired the relationship, improved the trust, and were able to come up with a mostly okay agreement. Now, we can take that same scenario. In this case, it was conflict about curfew. In the workplace, it can be a disagreement about anything, what somebody said at staff meeting, the schedule, the budget, who does what by when and how, the parking space, what kind of coffee we order. It can be little issues to really deep, protracted interpersonal relationship issues. So that's why the conversation in stage 3 and listening for interests and listening for what's important to people is critical. Usually what happens in stage 3 is that when you've really built understanding, then in stage 4, which is looking at options and solutions, it just naturally occurs. The solutions seem to pop out of the woodwork. And then step 5 is following up. After you've made an agreement and you've looked at all the different options and you've made a solid agreement, what we definitely want to do is actually follow up. So many times people resolve a conflict or disagreement. Safety is now improved in the workplace. People are focused on their job. Near misses go down. Mishaps go down because they're attentive. They're not emotional. They're not distracted by their conflict. But then something little happens and it kind of gets under people's skin. And if they haven't followed up or talked about how they're going to resolve the issues if they happen again, they go back into that same deeply protracted, feeling wounded conversation. So we want to follow up and we want to have a plan together about if things go sideways. And you can actually say this right in the conversation. If things go sideways, how do we want to handle the conversation? What are we going to do? So if I feel that what we've talked about and worked on is not working for me, I would like to be able to come back to you and have a conversation. Before I bring it forward to my supervisor, before I file a complaint, before I let this get out of hand, I'd simply like a conversation with you. And the other person might say, you know what, I expect the same, Charmaine. If things go off the tracks, I want you to come to me first, and let's see if we can figure that out. And then the second part of that is then setting a date to get back together. So next Tuesday, can we get back together to follow up and just see how things are going? Follow-up is critical because often the little issues, remember the stone in the shoe? Those little issues start to pop for people, and if they haven't talked about what they're going to do to keep the relationship and the agreement on track, little issues become big things. And every time there's an additional conflict to deal with in that relationship, it becomes more and more complex. So the 5 steps: we prepare, then we figure out the issue or the topic of what we've got to solve. Then we have the conversation. We look at underlying interests and needs and fears and values. We listen for joint or shared interests, what's important to both of us. Step at opportunities, options, and solutions, and we actually make an agreement. We might even write the agreement down or email it to each other. And step number 5 is that we have a plan to follow up and that we actually follow up. When people resolve conflict, when people talk about what's been under their skin for a long time, safety can improve because we are not focusing on frustrations. We're not caught up in emotional baggage or drama. We're not focused on blame or judgment. We're more solution focused, and we're certainly not distracted. And many accidents happen because we are not present. We're distracted. So that's one of the benefits. Now let's talk about what do we do after and how can we change our workplace to be more conflict responsive. Here's how you create a conflict responsive workplace. First of all, help people understand that conflict isn't necessarily bad or wrong, that it simply is, and it's going to happen. In fact, conflict can be great. Conflict can bring new solutions to old problems. Conflict can restore trust, build relationships, provide new ideas, create inner energy and synergy amongst people. It can form new levels of trust, but it's got to be managed effectively. So set the tone, create a culture where conflict can be dealt with effectively. Deal with it early, deal with it quickly, deal with it effectively. The other things we can do is provide training. I go into workplaces all the time and provide training on conflict resolution, communication skills, and negotiating in an interest-based way. One of the things I actually love to do is before companies that are unionized, I do this a lot with municipal governments, is I go into the organization and work with the negotiating team, so with the union and the management together. And we have a 2-day or a 1-day workshop around what interest-based negotiations are and how these two groups who have very different viewpoints, very different needs, they're negotiating for different priorities, they have different agendas, how they can actually have their conversations in a way that maintains the relationship. Because in a unionized environment, at the end of the day, you still all work together. You're still all employees of the same organization, so relationships do matter. The negotiation ends, but our job continues. So we go in and provide that training. I've got some municipalities, I've been doing that for years, and they have found that their negotiations go faster. Relationships are not damaged. The agreements that they settle on are more creative and more supportive to both parties. And most importantly, that they get through it with minimal stress. Negotiations can be tough. Now, some of the other things we can do to promote healthy conflict resolution in the workplace and resilience so that our safety is increased and our near misses are decreased is that we can also provide people with conflict coaching or mentoring. Sometimes people just simply don't know how to bring up an issue. So if you have the ability to contract an external coach or mentor or conflict instructor, conflict resolution instructor, you can actually provide those people with some soft skills training or mentoring to help them prepare for the conversation that they're going to have. The other thing you can do is check your policies. Make sure you've got good, solid policies and procedures around how to respond to conflict. And the other thing that you can do is you can teach people how to work together effectively by how you show up. So how you address conflict and how you deal with issues that are uncomfortable teaches people how to treat you. We can do a lot just by simply how we show up. And then the other element I wanted to share with you was the team charter. Now, a team charter is a facilitated process. I love facilitating team charters, where I go into an organization and work with the team and the leader. So they're all one group. There's no us against them, me against you. And the team charter is a process where people decide as a group how they're going to work together. So that means how they're going to work together in terms of being a team, how they're going to address issues, how they will provide feedback to one another, how they will resolve and address conflict, how they will be resilient as a team, how they will share in responsibility, how they'll keep their goals in the forefront. So a team charter is developed by the team, and then it's in writing. I love this. So it becomes not so much a policy, it's really an agreement that the team makes together around how we're going to work together, how we're going to accomplish our business goals together and have a strong, healthy team. and a safe environment. And they put this into writing. And I've got one organization I worked with 7 years ago, and they still have their team charter on the wall. I have another nonprofit organization that I worked with about probably 5 years ago now. And since that time of developing their team charter, half of their team has since gone and new employees have come on. But what I love is that this team took the whole concept of the team charter so seriously. The executive director is no longer there. It's one of the staff that was once a staff in the process who is now the executive director. She saw so much value in what she experienced as a team member that they still have their team charter, and they've kept their original charter, and they just keep adding signatures to it. So you can imagine every year they have turnover in that organization, and their list of people that have been trained on their team charter is building. Here's why people on a team tell me that they like the team charter. They simply say it gives them the operational tools and skills to make the policies work. Most organizations have a conflict resolution policy, and it usually says you will first go to the person that you have the conflict with and have a conversation. And that is perfectly good and perfectly true. The challenge is not everyone has the skills. Not everyone knows how to do that effectively. So a team charter can actually help take a policy and provide people with the skills and the training and the tools to be able to know how to make that policy work. The other thing that we can do is provide opportunities for the team to resolve issues at staff meetings. So if there's something that's gone off the tracks in the team, so not an interpersonal conflict, not a conflict between two people, but something that the team is being impacted by, if you have one of those situations, you can bring that up at a team meeting and work the issue together. It's a great opportunity to practice one person speaking at a time, gathering all the different diverging viewpoints around the table, figuring out what's important, those underlying interests, and then finding a solution that everyone can live with. And then having some of the different team members capture what they understood the solution to be. This is what we can do to really, really help practice conflict resolution. And again, I'll say it again, it's really important to bring in training into the organization. I've gone into many organizations that have tons of resources. They have no shortage of resources, and the teams have worked together for a long time, and they have had chronic conflict issues, and they've never been provided the skills to deal with conflict. You know, we hire people often for their technical skills and their abilities, which doesn't necessarily mean that they come to the workplace as great listeners or as people who are skilled and comfortable in resolving conflict. So we have to invest in our team to make sure that our teams have the training they need to be effective in these conversations, and to provide the support to them that if things are going off the tracks, they can help get things back on the tracks. So I'll just check in here to see if anyone has any questions right now. I have a couple that came in that I'm going to respond to before we close out for today. But any questions, type them in the chat box and I will look at those. One of the questions that came up for me to address on today's webinar was around the concept of conflict and safety. And this was an organization that has gone through a lot of change, and we're working at a very, very fast pace. And now that the economy in Canada has sort of slowed back a bit, and some provinces like Alberta, for example, that are really experiencing some economic downturns, this particular company's have a ton of layoffs, and the team is experiencing a lot of uncertainty. Nobody knows if they're next. That's the feeling. And so there's a lot of distrust. There's a lot of unresolved conflicts that are old conflicts. Some of them I heard were 5-year-old conflicts that have started to rear their ugly head. And the question that came up is, how do we deal with those? Well, the first thing is if we have a perspective that we resolved a conflict with someone and it's now popped up, because when people are stressed, remember what I said earlier about mindset? If we have a mindset that we're worried, we're fearful, we're stressed, the world kind of, like our brain looks for reasons to support that perspective. So we find other things to be worried or stressed about. It's simply what our brain does. And what we have to be really careful of with mindset, if we have that perspective that the conflict was resolved and it's over, and the other person has the perspective of, here we go again, here's the conflict again, see, it wasn't resolved for me. We have to then go to that other person and say, you know, because they may not bring it up, but you're feeling the tension in the relationship, you're feeling something is off, we can simply use that as a feedback opportunity where we say, I'm sensing that something is different. What's going on? Or if somebody brings up the conflict again and you really had an opinion or an understanding that the conflict was resolved, you can simply ask an open-ended question. Help me understand why we're here again. I understood that we had resolved the conflict and things had been going great for the last couple of years. I'm confused as to why we're here again. What's happened that this conflict has sort of come back? And then I'm just quiet. I let them answer that. And often in the conversation, when you ask good questions, you get better answers. When you ask good questions, you get good answers that can help you solve the conflict. So my advice to this particular individual was, if it's bugging you or you're sensing it, they might not even be aware that they're treating you that way. So simply use it as an opportunity for feedback. And remember, if you come in with perspective, this is all about learning. This is not about blame or judgment. You're probably setting yourself up for a more effective conversation. So tomorrow we have not tomorrow. On the 6th, we have another webinar number 3. And the link is on the chat box right now, and you'll all get a link with the video replay. The webinar on Friday is about creating your safety and resilience plan for 2016-2017. We're also going to talk about more of the steps to create your own team charter. Some of you are more than prepared to actually walk away and facilitate a team charter. And we'll actually talk about, again, tying all 3 webinars in so that we can look at how our culture, that culture of safety, respect, and resilience, fits with conflict resolution and feedback in the workplace to increase safety, and how we can build our plan for resilience. Because we also know that in business, things go up and things go down. So the pace is going to get busier again, and people will be more distracted, and they'll be dealing with other priorities. And conflict might go underground for a while and then rear itself up again when the tension lets off a little bit. So we want to be prepared to be able to deal with the situations as they arise. Because here's the one thing we know for sure. Conflict is going to happen. It's a part of life. It's not a good part of life. It's not a bad part of life. It simply is a part of life. And the more prepared we are, the better our mindset around conflict, the more skills we have in our toolbox to deal with these situations, and the more trust in our own ability to get through it, we will be able to successfully resolve issues that come in front of us, because they will happen. Now, I want to make sure everyone reminds themselves about the webinar on Friday. I'll send you the link. If you didn't get a chance to listen to yesterday's webinar, I'll send you the link for that as well. It was a great conversation. I want to thank all of you for being here with us today and participating. I wish you all the best for NIOSH Week and to building a safe, healthy, respectful workplace. And if any of you have a difficult conversation coming up in the next day or so, I hope you've learned some tools that you can apply to help turn that confrontation back into a collaborative conversation. Again, I'm Charmaine Hammond. Thank you so much. Take care.
Charmaine Hammond is an international transformational speaker and has been changing lives through her company, Hammond International Incorporated. She is committed to helping people live inspired, resilient lives and transforming workplaces around the globe.